In November 1862, a man died in a small house in Rangoon, Burma. He was 87 years old. He was buried the same day, quietly, with no ceremony, in a garden near the house. The British authorities were in such a hurry to bury him that they didn't properly mark the grave. They were afraid it would become a shrine. India was not officially informed of his death. His grave was forgotten, built over, and only rediscovered in 1991 during construction work. The man's name was Bahadur Shah Zafar. He was the last emperor of India, and he had never wanted to be anything more than a poet. To understand how the last Mughal emperor ended up buried in Burma, you need to understand what the Mughal Empire had been. Babur founded it in 1526, a Central Asian conqueror who defeated the last Delhi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat. His grandson Akbar the Great expanded it across most of the Indian subcontinent. At its height under Akbar and his successors, the Mughal Empire controlled perhaps 25% of global GDP, richer than the whole of Europe at the time. The Taj Mahal, the Red Fort of Delhi, the Jama Masjid, institutions, art, literature, music. One of the greatest civilizations in human history. The decline began after Aurangzeb died in 1707. Succession wars, provincial governors who stopped sending revenue, Maratha power rising in the south and west. And then, in 1739, a catastrophe. The Persian Emperor Nader Shah invaded, sacked Delhi, massacred perhaps 30,000 civilians in a single day, and took the peacock throne, the most famous symbol of Mughal power, back to Persia. He also took the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Neither ever came back. The Mughal emperor who survived this was shattered. The empire never fully recovered. Into this declining empire came the British East India Company. Not a government, legally speaking, but a trading company with its own army. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, won partly through bribery. A British agent paid the commander of the opposing army to stand aside. The company became the dominant power in Bengal, the richest province of India. It expanded from there. War, subsidiary alliances, the slow absorption of Indian kingdoms one by one. By the late 18th century, it controlled more territory than most European states. The mechanism was ingenious and brutal. It was called the doctrine of lapse. If an Indian ruler died without a male biological heir, no adopted sons counted. The company took the kingdom. Rulers were dying without heirs all the time. The company simply waited. When the old king died, company administrators rode in and took the registers, the treasury, the land records. Families that had ruled for centuries found themselves pensioners overnight, and the British genuinely believed this was legitimate governance. That was the most disturbing part. By 1837, when Bahadur Shah Zafar became emperor at age 62, the Mughal Empire had been reduced to Delhi and its immediate surroundings. His primary income was a pension paid by the British East India Company. He had a court in the Red Fort. Poets, musicians, calligraphers, mystics. He himself was a fine poet. Zafar was his pen name, the name he chose for himself. It means victory in Persian and Urdu. He was also a Sufi mystic and a man of extraordinary religious tolerance. He celebrated both Hindu and Muslim festivals, which was not a political calculation but a genuine expression of who he was. His court was a world of Urdu poetry, ghazals, calligraphy, late Mughal miniature painting. It was also a world of complete political impotence. He had no army. He had no revenue. His sons had no career prospects. The British had already decided that when Zafar died, the imperial title would end. The pension would stop. The Red Fort would be taken. His sons knew this. They argued bitterly among themselves about succession to a throne that the British had already decided would not exist. Zafar spent his reign trying to write poetry and mediate between his quarreling sons and hold together a court that existed, in the end, on borrowed time. The British East India Company, by the 1850s, employed perhaps 300,000 Indian sepoys, soldiers, organized, trained, and armed in the European fashion. These men served the company, fought in its wars, conquered more of India on its behalf. They were the military backbone of British power in India. And they had grievances, deep ones, religious humiliation, social displacement, the sense that the world they had grown up in, the India of their fathers and grandfathers, was being dismantled and replaced with something alien. And then there was the cartridge, In 1857, the British introduced the new Enfield pattern 1853 rifle. To load it, a soldier had to bite the end off a greased cartridge. Rumors spread immediately, almost certainly accurate, that the grease was a mixture of pork, fat, and beef tallow. Pork is forbidden to Muslims. Beef is sacred to Hindus. Both communities were being asked to put this in their mouths as a condition of service. The company denied it. They issued a memorandum stating the grease was made of vegetable oil. The soldiers didn't believe them. The soldiers were right not to. At Meerut, a garrison town 40 miles north of Delhi, 85 sepoys refused to use the cartridges in late April 1857. They were publicly humiliated, stripped of their uniforms in front of their colleagues, given 10-year prison sentences, and marched away in chains. On the evening of May 10, 1857, their regiment mutinied. They freed the 85 men. They killed their British officers. And that night, they marched south through the dark, 40 miles, and arrived at the gates of Delhi at dawn on May 11, 1857. The sepoys stormed through Delhi, killing British residents. They went to the Red Fort. They found the emperor, 82 years old, using a cane, barely able to walk, and they demanded he lead them. He refused. He told them he was an old man, a poet, that he had no army and no means to lead a rebellion. The sepoys were not interested in his objections. 2 British officers were brought before him and killed. The message was clear. Retreat was no longer possible. If he refused to lead, the British would assume he had conspired with the sepoys anyway and punish him as if he had. He agreed. He became, at 82, the nominal emperor of a rebellion he had not planned and did not want. Word spread across northern India with astonishing speed. Within weeks, the rebellion had engulfed Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, Bareilly, large parts of the Gangetic Plain. The sepoys fighting in the name of Bahadur Shah Zafar represented something larger than just a military mutiny. They were fighting for a world that still had Mughal emperors in it, that still had Indian kings, that was not entirely British. The British called it the Indian Mutiny. Indians came to call it the First War of Independence. The naming argument has never fully resolved. In Jhansi, in central India, the queen whose husband had just lost his kingdom under the doctrine of lapse, Rani Lakshmi Bai, joined the rebellion. She was approximately 29 years old. She had been fighting to have her adopted son recognized as heir to the throne of Jhansi. The British refused and took the kingdom. She became the most famous rebel commander of 1857. She died in battle in June 1858, fighting against British forces outside Gwalior, reportedly still in her saddle as she fell. The British officer who pursued her recorded his admiration of her courage in his official report. He was sorry she was dead, he wrote, because she was the only man among the rebels. In Kanpur, the British called it Cawnpore. A massacre occurred that shaped British understanding of the rebellion for generations. A British garrison surrendered on a promise of safe passage. During the evacuation, violence broke out, disputed by historians as to who started it, and British soldiers were killed. Then, in the Bibigar, a house used to hold British women and children, the prisoners were killed. Their bodies were thrown down a well. The Bibigar massacre hardened British resolve and provided the emotional justification for reprisals that went far beyond military necessity. Delhi was under British siege from June 1857. The Mughal court inside was dysfunctional. Zafar's sons competed for power in the favor of different sepoy commanders. Supply broke down. Discipline collapsed. The old man wrote poetry and held court and tried to manage factions that were beyond his management. He had a poet's instinct for catastrophe. He could see what was coming. He wrote about it. He kept writing poetry even as the city fell apart around him. On September 14, 1857, the British launched their assault on Delhi. 6 days of brutal street-by-street fighting. The British used a 60-pound siege gun, called the Smasher, to breach the city walls. The fighting inside the city was close and vicious. By September 20th, Delhi was taken. Perhaps 27,000 people died in the fighting and its immediate aftermath. The city was then subjected to weeks of looting, burning, and reprisal killings. The Red Fort was occupied. The Jama Masjid, the great mosque Shah Jahan had built, was used as a military stable by British troops. Bahadur Shah Zafar fled south from Delhi with his wives and sons to Humayun's tomb. The magnificent 16th century Mughal mausoleum built for the second Mughal emperor set in formal gardens outside the city. He had nowhere else to go. On September 21st, 1857, a British officer named Major William Hodson arrived at the tomb with a small cavalry escort. He negotiated Zafar's surrender personally, offering the promise that Zafar's life would be spared. Zafar surrendered. He came out of the tomb and was taken into British custody. He was 82 years old. The next day, Major Hodson returned to Humayun's tomb to take custody of Zafar's 3 remaining sons and a grandson. A large crowd of Indians had gathered around the princes. Hodson ordered the crowd to disperse. Then he took the princes from their palanquins, personally shot all 3 dead on a roadside, and cut off their heads. He wrote about this in a letter home, describing it with something close to satisfaction. The heads were brought to Delhi. They were displayed to the public. Accounts differ on whether they were shown to Zafar himself in his cell. Most historians believe they were. The British military tribunal convened in Delhi in January 1858. The charge was treason against the British East India Company. Zafar was defended after a fashion. He argued he had not instigated the rebellion, that the sepoys had forced themselves on him, that he had tried to restrain their violence. These were factually credible arguments. They were also irrelevant. The verdict was predetermined. The tribunal needed a legal justification for the exile of the last Mughal emperor, and they produced one. He was convicted. The sentence, exile for life. The sentence could have been death. Many in the British military wanted it. The argument against execution was not mercy. It was strategic calculation. Making a martyr of an 82-year-old poet might inflame Indian opinion further. Exile was cleaner. Exile was erasure. Send him to Burma, keep him alive in obscurity, and the Mughal dynasty would end not with a dramatic execution, but with a quiet death in a foreign country that nobody would remember. In October 1858, Bahadur Shah Zafar, 83 years old, was put aboard a ship. With him went his wife Zeenat Mahal, a few servants, and a handful of family members. He had lived his entire life in the Red Fort and the lanes of Delhi. He had never traveled farther than the outskirts of the city. He was taken to Rangoon, the capital of British Burma, and installed in a small house. The house was barely furnished. The pension he received was a fraction of what he had received in Delhi. He had no books, no poets, no musicians, no court. He had his memory, his faith, and a pen. In Rangoon, Zafar wrote poetry. He continued writing ghazals, the lyric love poetry of the Urdu tradition, and verses about loss, about exile, about the city he would never see again. Delhi appears in his exile poetry as a recurring presence, almost a person he is mourning. He could see that his pen name, Zafar, meaning victory, was the cruelest possible irony. He wrote about that too. One of his most famous couplets, composed in exile, "How unlucky is Zafar, even for burial. He could not get 2 yards of earth in the land of his beloved." He wrote this knowing he was going to die in Burma. He was right. Zeenat Mahal, his favorite queen, was allowed to accompany him into exile. She wrote letters to the British authorities requesting better conditions, better pension, clemency, return to India. Every letter was denied or ignored. She outlived him and continued to petition for years after his death, seeking to have his remains returned to Delhi. The British never agreed. She died in 1882 in Rangoon, still in exile, having never returned to India. The rebellion itself, the 1857 uprising, was suppressed with a ferocity that alarmed even some British observers. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Mass executions occurred across northern India. The signature British punishment for captured sepoys was to tie them to the muzzles of artillery cannons and fire. It scattered the bodies so thoroughly that no burial was possible. Deliberately chosen as a punishment designed to horrify Hindus and Muslims both, for whom proper burial of the body is religiously essential. Estimates of Indian civilians and soldiers killed in the aftermath of the rebellion range from 800,000 to over 1 million. The rebellion's political consequence was the end of the British East India Company. The Government of India Act 1858 dissolved the company and transferred all its powers directly to the British Crown. India was now formally part of the British Empire, governed by a Secretary of State in London and a Viceroy in Calcutta. The company that had started as a group of merchants getting a royal charter to trade pepper had, over 258 years, conquered one of the richest subcontinents on Earth. Now it was dissolved. Its job was done. In 1858, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation to the people of India. She promised fair treatment, respect for religion, equal opportunity. She promised not to extend British territories by war. Several of the promises were kept. Several were not. The expansion of British territory continued. In 1876, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. She was given the title that the Mughals had held. She was declared the supreme sovereign of a subcontinent that another dynasty had built and ruled for 3 centuries. She never visited India. She learned some Urdu. Her personal assistant in her later years was a man named Abdul Karim, whose father had been a prisoner during the 1857 rebellion. History is never simple. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, taken by Nader Shah from the Mughal treasury in 1739, then changing hands through Afghan and Sikh rulers, was surrendered to the British East India Company in 1849 when they annexed Punjab. It had been taken from the Sikh Maharaja Duleep Singh, who was 10 years old at the time. He was taken to England, converted to Christianity, and given a comfortable life as a pet of the British aristocracy. He asked for the Koh-i-Noor back for the rest of his life. He never got it. It is now in the Tower of London. Bahadur Shah Zafar died on November 7, 1862. He was 87 years old. He had spent 4 years in Rangoon. The British buried him the same day, in a garden behind his house, in an unmarked grave. The speed of burial and the absence of ceremony were deliberate. They did not want a Mughal emperor's grave in Burma. They did not want pilgrims. They did not want a shrine. They did not want the last Mughal emperor to become a focus of Indian sentiment. They buried him quickly and hoped he would be forgotten. For over a century, the grave was effectively lost. Locals knew vaguely where it was. There were no proper markings. The colonial authorities had succeeded in their goal. He was buried, and nobody officially knew where. Then, in 1991, workers carrying out construction in that part of Yangon found human remains. Archaeologists examined them. The location matched historical accounts of where Zafar had been buried. The grave was confirmed. A simple shrine was built. The shrine in Yangon today is a functioning dargah, a Sufi Islamic shrine. Pilgrims visit from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. His poetry is read there. Prayers are said in multiple languages. The last emperor of India, buried in Myanmar, is venerated by people who cross international borders to reach him. He had outlasted the British plan for his erasure. What the 1857 rebellion revealed about the British in India was not what the British wanted to believe about themselves. They believed they were bringing civilization, order, rational governance, modern institutions. What 1857 revealed was that this belief was not shared by the people being governed. The rebellion was not just about greased cartridges. It was about the doctrine of lapse taking kingdoms. It was about Christian missionaries backed by the state. It was about the transformation of Indian legal and social systems. It was about the fact that the conquerors genuinely believed the conquered should be grateful. The debate about what to call 1857 is itself revealing. The Indian Mutiny is the British framing, soldiers breaking their oath. The First War of Independence is the Indian nationalist framing, a people rising against colonial rule. Both framings are partial. It was a mutiny. Sepoys did break their military oaths. It was also a rebellion with genuine political content and support beyond the military. The naming argument tells you something about how history is a contest over meaning, not just over facts. Zafar's poetry survived everything. His ghazals circulated in manuscript, then in print, across British India, across the partition of 1947 into India and Pakistan, across the diaspora of South Asians around the world. He is claimed by both India and Pakistan. He is a poet of the Urdu tradition, and Urdu is the language of both countries' classical culture. His most famous lines are quoted in films, in books, at funerals, at weddings. The last emperor who had no power kept something alive in his pen that outlasted the empire that erased him. The Red Fort of Delhi. Lal Killa, where Zafar had lived all his life, became a British military barracks after 1857. It remained one until 1947. The first act of independent India's government was to hoist the Indian national flag from the Red Fort's battlements on August 15, 1947. Jawaharlal Nehru spoke from the ramparts. The symbolism was deliberate and exact. The place where the last Mughal emperor had lived under British rule became the place where the first Prime Minister of independent India announced freedom. The Red Fort today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the site of India's Independence Day ceremony every year. The British officers who suppressed the 1857 rebellion were celebrated at home. Major Hodson, who shot Zafar's sons and cut off their heads, was considered a hero by many in Britain. He was killed in the final months of the rebellion in 1858. His letters home, describing the execution of the princes with evident pride, were published and widely read. They are still in archives. They are not comfortable reading. After 1857, the British approach to India changed. The confident interventionism of the company era gave way to a more cautious, more explicitly racial hierarchy. Indian princes were no longer taken over. They were managed, given uniforms and titles, and kept as ceremonial allies. The Indian army was restructured. The social distance between British and Indian increased. The phrase, the Raj, British rule, came to mean the more settled, racially stratified system that emerged after 1858. The question 1857 poses, and never fully resolves, is about the nature of empire. The East India Company was a private enterprise that conquered a subcontinent. It built institutions that its defenders cite as benefits. It also extracted enormous wealth from India, destroyed Indian industries, and governed in the interest of Britain rather than India. The balance sheet of empire is genuinely contested. What is not contested? Zafar died in Rangoon. Zafar wrote a final couplet that has become one of the most quoted lines in Urdu literature. He wrote it knowing he would never see Delhi again, knowing he was going to die in a foreign city, knowing his dynasty was over and his world was gone. How unlucky is Zafar, even for burial. He could not get 2 yards of earth in the land of his beloved. He was right about the burial. He could not have known that 130 years later, his grave would be found, and that people would come from across the world to visit it. The last emperor of India died in a small house in Rangoon in 1862. He was buried in an unmarked grave that day. The British thought they had erased him. They had not. His grave was found in 1991. His poetry is still recited at weddings and funerals across South Asia. The dynasty that had built the Taj Mahal and ruled one of the richest empires in human history ended with an old man who wanted to write poetry, who had revolution thrust upon him by soldiers he had not summoned, who was convicted of treason against a company that had taken his empire, and who spent his last years writing ghazals in a foreign city about the home he would never see again. His pen name was Zafar, victory. In the end, the poetry was the only victory he had. It turned out to be enough.